This episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Mara Salvatrucha. The first blow came without warning. Pelon felt a metal ring crush his cheekbone. He crumbled to the concrete floor of the garage as a man began a slow count. Uno, a kick to the head. Dos, a punch to the nose. Tres, a knee to the groin. Pelon lost track as a half dozen homeboys pounded away. It was a cool night in November 2013, and Pelon thought it might be his last. Fuck it, he thought. At least I'll go out like a real motherfucker. Siete. This was his cue. Not only was he gonna take all the punches and kicks these fools were giving him, but he was also gonna fight back and prove to them that he wasn't no punk. Ocho. He swung a right hook as hard as he could and felt his knuckles make contact with someone's head. Nueve. Just as someone punched him in the back of his head, he countered with an uppercut that landed on someone's face. Diez. Once. Doce. When the count reached 13, it was over. The group pulled back and cheered. Welcome to the Mara. In Pelon's mind, he had just reached the pinnacle in his life. He had proudly just become the member of a gang he had always feared and hated. A gang he was not only willing to die for, but also a gang that he was also eager to kill for. But not in the way that the Mara would have expected. He was willing to die taking the gang down, and he was eager to kill anyone who might have tried stopping him. The assault was an initiation. After months of running with his assailants in and out of Boston, Pelon was now an official member of what many consider to be the most dangerous gang in America, La Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13. Like many new recruits, he was an El Salvadorian immigrant who had fled his violent homeland for a better life in the United States. But he was hardly a natural fit for the gang. At 36, he was more than twice the age of the average MS-13 homeboy teenagers typically groomed or intimidated to join at local high schools. He also lacked the signature tattoos that sometimes covered their entire faces and heads, an unofficial MS-13 uniform, blue t-shirt, LA Dodgers baseball cap, and Nike Cortez sneakers. He preferred collared golf shirts and linen shorts. Getting jumped in was never part of his plan, and he honestly didn't like the idea of being initiated this way. At 36, he was well aware of how most gangs operated and how they recruited their new members. This was something he studied and had acquired a lot of knowledge about. But this was ridiculous tradition that never made sense to him. He thought to himself, if I run this neighborhood like I own it, if I'm always repping it like it's mine, and if I terrorize it like it's nobody's business, then I damn sure don't need nobody socking me in the lip or punching me in my eye to tell me I'm from here and that this is my hood. But this was their tradition, and this was how it was done, period. If he really wanted in, and if he really wanted to be a Mara, then this was a small sacrifice he was just gonna have to make. Too much depended on it. He was a drug dealer who had been paying the gang for protection as he moved cocaine and guns up and down the East Coast. For cover, Pelon drove a gypsy cab around Chelsea, Massachusetts, a city of 35,000 across the Mystic River from Boston. He quickly became the preferred driver of gang leaders. As MS-13 systematically killed its rivals in the 18th Street gang, he had driven members to bury bloody machetes, their weapon of choice, and reveled in their war stories. Now that he was a full-fledged homeboy, they expected more of the man they called the doggy with the car. As Pelon studied himself in the garage that served as the clique's clubhouse, Casper, a local MS-13 leader, put his hand on the new member's shoulder. It's time to look for and kill chavalas, he said, using street slang for punk. There was just one problem. Though his new friends didn't know it, Pelon was already working with the rival crew, a task force of federal, state, and local law enforcement officials dedicated to dismantling MS-13. Since taking office, then President Donald Trump has often used MS-13 as a political shorthand for immigrant crime, a justification for hardline immigration policies. His administration argues that this bloodthirsty gang of animals represents one of the gravest threats to American public safety. This rhetoric is just more of this racist coward's propaganda. That's a fact, and anyone who's honest about this lame's agenda and his political views when it comes to immigrants and foreign policy knows that he's a real hater when it comes to the raza. But to be sure, MS-13 is not the largest gang in America. Its members number around 10,000 nationwide, and despite the president's emphasis, analysis say it's far from a national threat. Its activities are generally restricted to a few urban cities on the west and east coast, and its victims are typically members of rival gangs. Who really cares about rival gangs killing rival gangs? Let's be honest about that. Some might even say that this is actually like performing a public service. But for the communities where MS-13 operates, its brutality is infamous. Teenagers cutting down teenagers with machetes. And this up-close and personal way of killing people is customary in El Salvador. Carrying a machete out there is like part of your everyday attire, like wearing a pair of socks or a t-shirt. And kids as young as 7 and 8 will kill you and hack you to death if they want something you got. The gang itself was born in Los Angeles in the 1980s, when waves of refugees fled a civil war in El Salvador, clashing with black and Hispanic street gangs in Southern California. They banded together to form their own organization. Over time, La Mara Salvatrucha became increasingly violent and moved east, establishing footholds in the suburbs of Washington, New York, and Boston. Unlike other gangs, MS-13 didn't exist purely to make money. They differed from other gangs like the Mexican Mafia, the Nuestra Familia, or the Aryan Brotherhood. These criminal organizations focus primarily on generating money, power, and dominance over the prison systems. MS-13, on the other hand, sold guns and drugs, but life revolved around something else. Territory. MS-13 was after neighborhoods, domain, whole cities, and states. Never before has there been a gang that's operated like MS-13. Not even the Italian Mafia. This gang inundates its opposition by swarming in with mass numbers, and then it infiltrates the area and claims the territory. Specifically, the territory of its chief rival, another Salvadorian gang named Barrio 18 or 18th Street. The MS motto, Mata, Viola, Controla, or Kill, Rape, Control. To fund its expansion, it forced fellow undocumented immigrants, cab drivers, dishwashers, and housekeepers to pay protection money of $5 to $10 a week. Terrified of deportation, most coughed up instead of going to the police. Those who didn't often faced the end of a blade. Mario Millet had never seen anything like MS-13. He was an undercover officer in the Massachusetts State Police who had worked to take down a number of gangs since the 1990s, from the Hells Angels to the Latin Kings. But MS-13's ultra-violence shocked him, especially after members raped and battered 2 disabled teenagers in 2002. Both girls were deaf, and one was confined to a wheelchair with cerebral palsy. One of the girls' fathers, an 18th Street associate, had apparently disrespected the gang, and MS-13 had taken its revenge. The crime became national news, and the FBI turned its North Shore Gang Task Force, an elite squad of federal, state, and local police serving Boston's northern suburbs. The work was hard, and progress was slow. Millet and many of his colleagues didn't speak Spanish, a huge disadvantage in the gang's base of Chelsea, where more than 65% of the population is Latino. Victims were reluctant to cooperate, fearing for not only their lives, but those of their relatives in El Salvador, where MS-13 controlled much of the country. The team's efforts resulted in sporadic arrests and some deportations, but the gang continued to kill. Then, in late 2012, years before Trump came into office, Miller received word from the FBI's top man in El Salvador. A local had approached him about MS-13 and he wanted to wear a wire. His name was Pelon. His story, culled from court documents, audio transcripts, witness testimony, and interviews with law enforcement, provides a harrowing glimpse into the murderous world of MS-13 and the high-stakes strategies the authorities have used to thwart it in Boston and along the East Coast. On January 20, 2013, as President Barack Obama was sworn in for a second term, Millet and 2 of his colleagues flew to El Salvador. FBI Special Agent John Kelly was a Massachusetts native who had become an MS-13 expert while working cases in California. And Scott Conley, a Chelsea detective and former Green Beret, had been tracking the gang since the late 1990s. Officially, their cover was humanitarian aid. They were working for a non-governmental organization observing the dire conditions at El Salvador's prisons, where MS-13 leaders, or La Ranfla, ran the gang's international operations. In reality, they had arrived to vet their potential informant. From 30,000 feet, the country looked like the perfect vacation destination. Blue surf, green mountains, lush hillsides. But on the ground, it was entering its 5th year as the murder capital of the world. When a Salvadorian official picked them up at the San Salvador airport, he told them to keep quiet about their mission. Loose talk within earshot of a bellhop, cab driver, even ununiformed police could make its way back to local MS-13 leaders. That night, Conley and Millett went exploring after a party at the U.S. Embassy. As they sipped beers on a street corner, a van screeched to the curb and its sliding door whipped open. Men in tactical gear and full-face shields grabbed them by their shirts and yanked them inside. The men were FBI agents and scolded the 2 police officers for walking around in gang-controlled territory. "Are you fucking crazy?" one FBI agent shouted at them. "We'll be finding pieces of you all over the neighborhood." The next morning, the 3 arrived at a hotel conference room. Millett in business attire and Conley and Kelly in board shorts and flip-flops. They thought the meeting was later and had just finished surfing. Pelon showed up in a janitor's uniform, a disguise FBI officials gave him so he wouldn't attract attention. The upscale hotel catered to diplomats. He stood 5'11", with a muscle physique save for a slight paunch. He grinned at the officers. "You went to the beach?" he told Conley and Kelly, still wet from their morning workout. "I've never been to the beach in my country. Brave." Like many Salvadorians, Pelon fled the country as a teen during the Civil War in the 1980s, joining his brother in a trek north to Miami. For 7 years, as an undocumented immigrant, he sold cocaine and guns for a Mexican drug cartel. He reveled in the Magic City's excesses, living in a luxury condo and racing sports cars around South Beach. At his peak, he had $5 million in real estate assets. Then, in early 2002, he got busted and was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for drug trafficking. To shave time off his sentence, he fed the Drug Enforcement Administration information about associates in the cartel. The information led to new arrests, and authorities reduced his jail time by 3 years. Nobody ever suspected that he was ever providing the DEA with information, and he was never required to testify in these cases. If the DEA wouldn't have used him the way they did, he would have been considered a precipient witness and he would have been compelled to testify. To protect Pelon from retaliation, agents moved him to Florida to an immigration detention center in Massachusetts, where he awaited deportation to El Salvador. There, he quickly learned that his new cellmates were members of MS-13. He earned their trust by using the gang slang and dropping the names of drug dealers he knew from the 503, the area code for El Salvador. And since returning to his home country a few months earlier, he had kept in touch with many of his former cellmates. Now, sitting before police officers, Pelon ticked off a list of homeboys he had heard about: Casper, Animal, Demente, Muerto, Smiley, Chucky, Roca, Little Crazy, Tigre, Lobo. He told the trio that he could help the feds convict them all if he went undercover. But he wanted something in return: a new life in the U.S. Returning to El Salvador, a country he hadn't seen in decades, had been a shock. He was living in a tin-roof shack with family members. "This is not a third world country. This is a fifth world country," he told them. "I want to get my whole family out of here. I want my sister's kids to have schools, learn English, get educations." It was not the kind of arrangement the FBI would normally entertain. Bringing a convicted drug trafficker back into the U.S. as an undocumented immigrant is not easy. But as the task force knew after months of failed recruitment, no one had ever been willing to go undercover with MS-13. For the next hour, Conley peppered Pelon with questions about Chelsea gang members who had been deported and risen in the ranks of La Ranfla. Like most cops, he asked the typical questions. Who was doing what? Who was calling shots? Who was selling dope? Who was moving guns? Who had the most influence, etc., etc. Millet studied his demeanor. After nearly 2 decades of talking to criminals, he knew liars, but Pelon seemed legit. More of a businessman than a bad guy, nervous but sincere. Pelon didn't come across as having an agenda, and he seemed serious about working with them. At some point, the meeting wrapped up and the three of them stood up and shook hands. I feel like I can trust you guys, Pelon told them. You guys don't come across like feds. A Salvadorian military official working with the FBI then slipped Pelon out of the back of the hotel. The task force now had to convince justice and homeland security officials that the risk was worth the potential reward. The 3 cops went to the hotel bar. They ordered their beers and sat in silence for a while until Kelly asked a question that was all on their minds. How the fuck are we gonna pull this off? Millet kept another concern to himself. How the fuck are we going to keep this guy alive? A month later, in February, Pelon was back in the United States and working for the government. Operation Mean Streets was on. Pelon was posing as an undocumented immigrant, and it took him less than 48 hours to find Mi Salvador, a Chelsea bar filled with Salvadorians, some selling fake papers that would help him get a Massachusetts ID. He checked in a low-rent motel in a gang-riddled part of the city and reconnected with MS-13 members he had met in ICE detention. After a few weeks, he noticed that some of the most notorious homeboys couldn't afford cars. Pelon met with his handlers, and together they devised a plan. He'd become a gypsy cab driver, and the feds could wire the car to record confessions. Think about it, Pelon told them. These chavalas love to talk. Let's drive around and let them. To cement his bond with the gang, he would hire members to provide muscle as he moved drugs from Boston to New Hampshire, long rides where he could talk to MS-13 leaders about their crimes. The feds were impressed. FBI agents bought a used silver Toyota Camry with tinted windows and outfitted it with hidden cameras over the driver's seat. They installed a kill switch so they could stop the engine and surround the vehicle if things went sideways. They also gave Pelon a miniature recording device to hide in his clothing and 2 cell phones. One to record his conversations with MS-13 members, the other to talk to his handlers. For 2 months, Pelon drove around Chelsea, dropping hints to anyone with MS-13 tattoos that he needed help with a bit of business. He also sold a gun to a guy with gang ties, telling him he needed a protection detail. Then he had a breakthrough. 2 men got into his cab. One took the passenger seat. Gang ink covered his left arm. The other sat in the back. He was short and looked too old to be a gangbanger. The tattooed man turned and pulled down the neckline of his t-shirt. The scripted initials of M and S filled his chest. "You're Pelon, right?" he asked. "Doggy, I heard you're looking for some people." Pelon felt a surge of adrenaline. He turned towards his passenger to capture the conversation and flashed the MS-13 horns, the gang's hand sign. The man introduced himself as Muerto, a homeboy in a Burgoyne clique called Eastside Local Salvatrucha. His clubhouse was a garage owned by the man in the back seat, Chichi. Like Pelon, Muerto had fled El Salvador for the US as a child. He stayed with his uncle in Los Angeles and washed dishes to pay back the loan his family had taken out to cover the cost of his coyote, the man who had smuggled him into the country. At 14, he was jumped in the MS-13. After stabbing a number of rivals, he was deported back to El Salvador, where La Ranfla promoted him. Now he was in Chelsea helping the gang expand, and he told Pelon that leaders in the 503 had vouched for him. This is the kind of credibility that Pelon needed. In the gang subculture, it's hard to maneuver and move if you don't have someone else validating your credentials or your credibility. Unless someone else knows you or puts their stamp on you insofar as vouching for you or claiming that they know you, it's hard to earn people's trust and confidence. That's why it's usually hard to infiltrate some of the prison gangs or other gangs that are a lot more close-knit. Someone's either gonna know you because they grew up with you, they know someone in your family, or they're related to you. Somehow, some way, we're all connected. So for Pelon, this was instant validation. Pelon detailed the scheme and ran it down to them. He would need security for a trip north to New Hampshire to deliver 5 kilos of cocaine. He and Muerto would take the Toyota and Chichi would follow in another vehicle. I hope that's how you pronounce that fool's name. Chichi, Cheche, I don't fucking know, but that's how I'm saying it. We need 2 cars, Chichi snapped. There's no problem with the front, but it's in the back that I need a tail, Pelon said, trying to ease the tension. So that in case the cops turn their lights on us, what you can do is burn some rubber or move away from them. Muerto and Chichi were silent. I don't trust anyone else, Pelon said, offering them $500 each for their trouble. The gang members agreed. A week later, the trio drove north, just as Pelon had planned. He picked up cocaine from an undercover FBI agent in a hotel parking lot just outside Boston and delivered the drugs to another agent in New Hampshire who posed as a buyer. Task force officers followed him along the way, and a SWAT team stood ready nearby in the event that Pelon blew his cover. The trip took 3 hours. Pelon was poised and professional. He was savvy in the ways of the streets, but his poise and his interaction with these guys is what really disarmed them and helped him earn their trust. One thing that gang members constantly do is to size each other up and to watch how each other moves. It's almost done religiously. Pelon continued the drive and he pointed out landmarks along the way, signaling his location to the task force officers listening to the wire. Muerto was chatty. This guy was a natural. He didn't have to ask the officers for directives or what he should do. He was smart and he had good foresight. He kind of reminds me of Lencho's ex-wife Debbie. She was the same way and she didn't have to ask questions. And she knew what to do. A couple of months earlier, he and other members came across a group of 18th Street guys in Chelsea Park. Because he'd been wearing the usual MS-13 colors, they immediately knew who he was. I flashed the MS and I said, "It's La Mara, you sons of bitches. What's up?" Muerto said he chased one guy and stabbed him with a military-style saber. Pelon praised him. "Cool, doggy." These types of cold confessions captured on hidden camera were exactly what the task force needed. This was the type of information that they needed to bury these guys. After the fake drug deal, Pelon met his handlers in the parking lot of his hotel outside Chelsea. The officers plugged a laptop into the cab's camera and downloaded the video, a process that would be repeated dozens of times in different locations. Pelon was in. Over the next 2 years, Pelon lived the Mara lifestyle. He walked it, talked it, breathed it, and lived it. He partied at destroyer houses, group homes shared by MS members, and curried favor with leaders' girlfriends by giving them fake luxury bags the FBI had seized in raids. Muerto became his road dog, his new best friend, and, after several drug runs, vouched for him at Chichi's garage. This was the trust that he needed in order to infiltrate the gang. The two saw each other every day, eating papusas, stuffed corn cakes, talking trash about other MS-13 cliques, and making drug runs. Soon, Muerto brought in other clique leaders on the protection jobs. Afterward, they asked Pelon for his cell number so they could hail rides. Sometimes the task force officers could protect him, other times he was on his own. There simply wasn't enough manpower to watch him around the clock. Pelon basically had to learn how to trust these guys, and Homeland Security needed to learn how to put trust in him. He also had to trust in his own skills and his own ability to stay flying below the radar. Because of the nature of the job, informants are often paranoid, driven by constant fear of being discovered. And they have to be. Pelon certainly felt that way. Although officers are supposed to protect their informants and ensure their safety, Pelon never took any chances and always took steps to look out for himself. He had to. He was in deep at this point, and one misstep could cost him his life. He never lived in one place too long, moving from cheap hotel to cheap hotel. He often called his handlers to ask about routine chores, like where he could get his hair cut, or gripe about his FBI pay, about $1,000 a month. "I need a new washing machine," he growls to Millet when the one at his rent by the week motel broke. Pelon wasn't the type of guy who was always trying to work the system either, but if he needed something, he wasn't shy about asking. Once or twice a week, Pelon would meet with his handlers in a parking lot, typically late at night, to discuss the intel he was gathering. 7 years of living well in Miami had left him with a refined palate, and he complained when Conley would take him to chain restaurants like the Border Grill. "This is shit with taco sauce on it," he said. He preferred the good Dominican spots that Millet frequented, the small mom and pop restaurants. Those are the ones that cook some bomb ass food. What was most important for Pelon, however, was respect. And when he felt that he didn't get it, he would call Millet. "I need to see Mr. Peter," Pelon barked, referring to Levitt, the federal prosecutor. He asked Millet to take him to the U.S. Attorney's office on the 9th floor of the federal courthouse in South Boston so he could air his complaints in late-night grievance sessions. His biggest concern: when is my family getting here? For Pelon, this was a legitimate concern, as promises about moving his entire family seemed to be sketchy at best. The officers seemed adamant about moving him, and there didn't seem to be any issues. But when he mentioned his family, he sensed an apprehensiveness in them that made him question this further. One night in November 2013, Pelon and Muerto were driving to dinner when Muerto asked him to make a quick stop at a garage. He needed to drop off his weekly membership dues. These are basically the gang's taxes, or the commission. We called them monthlies since they were due every month. But this money is... Casper and the clique had other plans. When Pelon and Muerto arrived, the gang formed a circle and pushed Pelon in the center. "He's been hanging with the dudes," the leader told the group. "We gotta jump him in." Pelon braced himself. Nah, doggy," he yelled. "I'm too old for that shit." It was as much as a surprise to Muerto as it was to Pelon. Typically, the honor is reserved for guys who have killed 18th Street rivals. But Pelon had become such a mainstay that Casper made an exception. The next morning, Pelon met up with Millet and Conley. A large welt bulged above his right eye and his body was covered with bruises. He was embarrassed. He had just been beaten up by a bunch of kids half his age, but homeboy status gave Pelon a deeper level of access to the gang. He was now able to record members-only clique meetings where MS-13 discussed, for example, collecting dues from members who held jobs as handymen or busboys in some of Boston's finest restaurants. That status also brought more pressure. He had a girlfriend, someone else who could suffer retribution if he was discovered. Every day he was surrounded by self-described killers like Chucky, a member of a teenage crew that had recently brawled with 18th Street outside a domestic violence shelter. A 38-year-old woman of 3 died in the crossfire. The police officers were nervous. The FBI had given the informant leeway to commit certain crimes to maintain his cover. Murder was not one of them. If Casper ordered Pelon to kill, the feds would have to pull the plug on the operation. But sooner or later, both Pelon and the officers knew that this was going to become a problem. They just hoped that it would happen a lot later than sooner. Just before Christmas in 2014, as he was settling into bed with his girlfriend, Pelon got a call from Crazy, the leader of another local clique. An MS-13 member named Vida Loca had been drinking at an illegal after-hours bar in a Chelsea apartment when an 18th Street rival put out a lit cigarette on his arm. Vida Loca called for backup, and members brought a gun, unleashing a rapid fire of beans that killed one and left another critically injured. Crazy needed Pelon to help the homeboy flee the state. "You want to go to New York to drop him off over there? What do you say?" Crazy asked, offering him $400. Pelon couldn't say no. Crazy had a quick temper. "Be careful right now when you go," Crazy told him, "so that the police don't stop you, man." Pelon hung up and paced back and forth in his hotel room. He needed a way to alert the task force without blowing his cover. He called one of his handlers. "I'll take out my rear tail light," he said, "so you can follow me easy and pull me over for the broken tail light." Pelon then drove to an East Boston destroyer house where he picked up Crazy, the gang's leader's girlfriend, and the killer who was about to go on the lam. This was an important assignment for Pelon, as he couldn't afford to drop the ball on this one. Assisting someone like Vida Loca and his girl would just give Pelon more of the type of credibility he needed. But Pelon wondered what Vida Loca's plans might have been once they got pulled over for the broken taillight. He worried that this might have adverse effects in one of two ways. For one, Vida Loca could possibly tell him to keep driving if they got lit up, or worse, he might even draw his weapon and shoot the officer once he approaches their vehicle. After all, Vida Loca was wanted for a murder, so he didn't have anything to lose. And the other possibility is that Vida Loca might get furious with Pelon for driving him in a vehicle that had a broken taillight on it. He might actually blame him for getting caught up, because it should have been on Pelon to know these things and to make sure that the car was legit before picking him up. All he could do was hope that neither one of these two scenarios didn't play out, because either way, the officers weren't going to allow Vida Loca to get away on a murder one warrant. Millet was waiting on the Massachusetts Turnpike. When Pelon drove by, he flashed his blue dome lights. Once Pelon pulled over, Millet shined his flashlight into the car, his other hand on his gun holster. "You have a broken taillight," he said. Pelon protested. "We didn't do nothing, man." Millet then pulled out a be on the lookout, or bolo sheet, with Vida Loca's face on it. He asked everyone to step out of the vehicle and arrested the shooting suspect. Crazy was livid and suspicious. This was quickly turning into one of the scenarios that Pelon had worried about. Pelon got back on the road, but the gang leader brandished his machete at his side. "Pull over, doggy," he said. Crazy then walked to the back of the car to inspect the taillight. It was out, like Millet had said. Crazy moved around for a minute, trying to figure out what he should do, all the while holding the machete tightly to his side. For a brief moment, Pelon felt threatened because of the machete Crazy was holding, and he wondered if he should give the signal for his handlers to intervene, but cooler heads eventually prevailed. After Crazy seemed to have calmed down, and with nothing but mere suspicions to go off of, there wasn't much he could do. 6 weeks later, Pelon made another enemy. He stopped at a Mexican restaurant and found Lobo, a fellow clique member, at the bar drinking. It was a violation of gang rules because being drunk in public could lead to fights with civilians, something the gang tries to avoid. After several tequila shots, Lobo snatched a gun from his waistband and pointed it at a group of strangers. "Anyone want some beans?" he yelled. "I guess these guys call bullets beans." Pelon walked out and called the feds. This was a huge oversight on his part, and it came real close to blowing his cover. Minutes later, when Lobo found 3 police officers waiting for him in the parking lot, he remembered seeing Pelon's phone call. He thought he might be a snitch and told Chichi about his suspicion. This was the kind of attention that Pelon didn't need. Putting himself under a cloud of suspicion only made things more difficult, and it just caused unnecessary attention. Negative attention. The two asked Casper for a green light, the gang slang for permission to kill Pelon. But luckily for the informant, Lobo was considered unreliable and prone to explosions of violence. Casper had ordered him to stay sober, and the incident in the restaurant was a clear transgression. The gang leader ordered the clique to give Lobo a 13-second beating. But he didn't deny their request to kill Pelon. He just needed more evidence to justify putting a blade to his neck. Pelon knew the penalty for snitching, and he got a reminder in the spring of 2015 when 2 homeboys named Roca and Chucky got into his cab and started talking about a fellow member who went to squeal to the cops. "Who?" Pelon asked. "Clacker," Roca said. "We'll grab his head. We'll cut it off, dude, so that way he won't talk." Pelon's heart sank. Many of the gang members he met disgusted him. He called them MS motherfuckers. But in Clacker, he saw a lost 15-year-old boy. A couple of years earlier, Clacker's mother had paid a coyote the family life savings $2,500 to smuggle him out of Honduras after 18th Street killed his older brother. Following a 2-month trek through the desert, he was detained at the border and then sent to Massachusetts to live with the father he had never met. 2 weeks into his freshman year at Chelsea High Informant School, he met Roca and Chucky, who showed him a slickly produced recruitment video that romanticized thug life the way Islamic State militant group ISIS did jihad. A hip-hop song thumped in the background. "We come with knives and machetes to kill the enemy, and we are prepared to cut them from their neck down to their navel." Clacker joined MS-13 and was soon hunting a rival that had killed his brother and now teased him in the high school cafeteria. "You guys are certain the son of a bitch snitched?" Pelon asked Roca and Chucky. They said they were, but they were wrong. Clacker had bragged about being MS-13 to girls at school, info someone then passed to the police. He hadn't snitched. Pelon decided to play along with Roca and Chucky. "Fuck, I'm in this too," he told the gang members. "This man is going around snitching, bro. He could give them all 4 of our names, doggy." After Roca and Chucky left the car, Pelon called Clacker. "Leave," he told the teenager. "You've been given a green light for real." It was a risky move. If it worked, he would have saved Clacker's life. If it failed, Pelon could be murdered. He met with his handlers and shared the audio of the plot to kill Clacker. They had to be very careful with this because they were talking about whacking a fellow gang member. This put Pelon in a precarious position. Worst case scenario, Pelon ends up running into the target while he's out with other Mata members, and they wind up having to shut down the whole operation before Pelon's forced to participate. The feds were wary, but they also saw an opportunity to flip the young gang member who could give them even more inside information and corroborate Pelon's recordings. This is the same way the cops flipped Jesse Conejo Rodriguez in my case. They spooked him into cooperating by telling him I had already issued a green light against him and that there was nothing he could do to change it. So he might as well do what he could to help himself. And of course, he bit like a big-mouthed bass and gave them everything he knew. That night, Conley and FBI Special Agent Jeff Wood visited Clacker's house. Apparently, they told this guy, "Your friends are going to kill you." But Clacker refused to cooperate. He tried to play hardball, and he actually held his mud. Wood turned to the boy's grandmother. "We warned him. If he wants our help, he needs to ask for it," the agent said. Clacker was one of them type of guys who refused to believe anything the feds told him, and he just believed that it was all a ploy to get him to flip. But in this case, he was dead wrong. Meanwhile, to maintain his cover, Pelon persuaded Roca and Chucky to use him as the driver for the hit. The same night, Pelon circled the boy's house with 2 homeboys and a hitman named Villano, whom MS-13 had dispatched from New Jersey. This is common practice for gangs to have a gang member from another city, state, or area come in and hit a target to avoid detection. Pelon listened to the assassin explain with clinical detachment how he intended to kill Clacker. Nice and easy, just like with the hen, when you search under the feathers so that you feel the pulse like that. You feel the son of a bitch like that until you feel the vein, and that's where you jab the knife in. Chucky pumped his fist in the air from the back seat and pulled out a machete as the car pulled to the house. But Clacker was gone. Clacker's father had driven him to the U.S. Attorney's office in South Boston to cut a deal. In return for his cooperation, the FBI would put the teenager and his family, including his mother in Honduras, into the witness protection program. But a few months later, as Clacker outlined for federal prosecutors a series of MS-13 robberies, he dropped a name that no one was expecting: Pelon. The FBI always seems to encounter these types of problems with its star witnesses or high-profile informants. It happened in Operation Black Widow with Daniel Lizard Hernandez and Robert Huerito Grattan. Both of these guys were accused of double-dealing while they were still active government informants. It happened again with Sammy the Bull Gravano in the prosecution of John Teflon John Gotti, and again with high-profile informant Ernest Chuco Castro when he was brought in to testify against the Mexican Mafia, and finally the infamous Whitey Bulger. When Pelon wasn't serving as the Bureau's inside man, the driver had been helping MS-13 members rob fellow gypsy cabs. He served as a getaway driver on the heist and took a share of the profits. It was a clear violation of his deal with the Bureau, and it put prosecutors in an awkward position. If they pressed charges, Pelon would be ineligible for witness protection if he eventually testified against the gang. If they let him off, it could harm the credibility of the FBI, an agency still smarting from public revelations about its unholy alliance with legendary Boston mobster Whitey Bulger, who committed 19 murders while working for the Bureau. Back at the MS-13 clubhouse, Clacker's disappearance fueled paranoia. Casper was already making members turn in their cell phones at the start of each meeting and patting them down for wires before they entered the garage. Pelon feared for his safety. and he had noticed Muerto looking at him suspiciously. Recently, they were driving in the cab when Muerto got a call from a fellow clique that needed backup in an 18th Street brawl. They raced to the scene. Wielding a knife, Muerto bolted after a rival and stabbed him repeatedly when he tried to escape under a car. But Pelon froze. "I didn't even know what was happening, dude," he told Muerto afterward. "I even got scared. I didn't know who to turn around and look for, if it was you guys, if it was the enemy, or the friend." That winter, the Salvadorian gang leaders called La Ranfla organized a national meeting of MS-13 in Richmond, Virginia. Demente, a top gang official, needed a ride. Pelon was wary of driving him. Demente had recently ordered the killing of a 15-year-old boy who had refused to join the gang. The boy was tricked into going to a beach where he was stabbed to death. Now, as Pelon headed south on I-95, Demente spent long stretches of time just staring at him. Pelon wondered if there was any meeting at all. Casper had been studying him more intensely too. Lobo had stopped speaking to him, and Chichi had dropped the drug protection runs altogether. This was turning all bad, and Pelon felt like he was being turned on. When they finally pulled up to a northern Richmond home, Pelon was convinced they were going to kill him. But inside, there were indeed leaders from California, Texas, Ohio, Arizona, Virginia, and Maryland, the largest assembly of MS-13 leadership in U.S. history. This meeting was a culmination of over almost 40 years of Mara Salvatrucha history. The gang's founder, Ernesto Miranda, is believed to have originated MS-13 in Los Angeles, California. The gang flourished in 1980, and between the late 1980s and 1990s, the Mexican Mafia and other storied gangs took notice of the growing MS-13 gang. These gangs admired MS-13's propensity for violence and the way it was conducting its business on the streets. As a result, the Mexican Mafia and other gangs in LA began a loose symbiotic working relationship with MS-13. This loose relationship began to fall apart in the mid-1990s until it eventually transcended into a nationwide conflict. By the millennium, MS-13 had already metastasized itself across the nation and was said to have grown over 50,000 members. The gang's founder, Ernesto Miranda, died in 1976. Mara Salvatrucha has stayed in the national headlines all over the country due to it being an extremely violent gang. But one of the other cases that made national headlines was the kidnapping murder of a documented informant named Brenda Paz. As a young girl, Brenda Paz ran away from home to join the MS-13 gang. Later, she became one of the most well-known witnesses against the gang, and she didn't live to see her 19th birthday. In 2001, Paz witnessed her boyfriend kill her best friend in cold blood in Virginia. The following year, she got caught up for her involvement in an auto theft, and as a result, she started talking to help herself. The information she gave to the federal and state authorities proved to be valuable, so valuable they placed her in the witness protection program. She wasn't just a witness, she was like the Rain Man of witnesses. Paz was eventually moved to a new state and given the chance at a new life, but her attraction to the gang remained strong. While in witness protection, Paz contacted old friends and escaped protection to meet up with gang members. She even let them visit her safe house in Minneapolis. Paz apparently assumed that because she had not yet testified, that she could possibly still salvage her loyalty with the gang. Unfortunately for her, this was a clear lack of understanding for gang politics and the seriousness of what happens when you break the gang's cardinal rule. Snitching or talking to the cops is punishable by death. But she hated rules and loved to talk, and the cops were very good listeners. She had been scheduled to testify for prosecutors in gang murder trials in Virginia and Texas. In the summer of 2003, Paz fled witness protection for the final time and returned to Virginia, but there was already a hit put out on her. At the time, Paz met with her old gang friends. She was 4 months pregnant. On July 13, 2003, Paz was lured out to a riverbank in Shenandoah County, Virginia, with several MS-13 members. She was led to believe that they were going to go kick back, drink beer, and party, just as they had done several other times in the past. At one point, Ismael Juarez Cisneros, Dennis Rivera, and Oscar Antonio Grande allegedly pulled out knives and surrounded Paz. When she realized the gravity of the deadly mistake that she had made, she began pleading with them not to kill her. But Cisneros allegedly told Paz, "You're already dead, you just don't know it yet." Then they began plunging their knives into her pregnant body. Paz and her unborn baby were stabbed a total of 16 times and were left to die. 3 weeks later, a fisherman found her mutilated body on the same riverbank. But the Paz case was one of just many that would rivet the nation. Now this case with Pelon was about to set the stage, but yet again. Appearing via WhatsApp from his El Salvador jail cell was a La Ranfla leader known as Sugar. The Mente asked Pelon to speak for his clique, the East Side locals. The first order of business was ominously snitches. "You must be very careful about who you bring in and talk to," Sugar told the group. "The FBI gives them a car, gives them money, gives them everything. And when they give them all that, they loosen their tongues, you know." Another leader called for Clacker's execution. The Mara makes him, the Mara removes him. Pelon's chest tightened, sweat soaked his t-shirt, which is where he hid a tiny recording device. Leaders moved on to other issues, but he stopped processing the information, staring blankly into the distance. He wondered if the task force officers were listening to his wire. Would his handlers save him from the blade? And then he heard his name. "What's happening, Pelon?" Sugar shouted. This was it, he worried. They knew. But to his relief, the leader wanted his thoughts on a different problem. Errant cliques that refused to pay dues to the gang's deportation fund, which MS-13 uses to bring homeboys back into the US. Casper had balked at paying. Seeing an opening, Pelon said he was willing to take over the clique. One leader had yet another idea. "Why don't you kill Casper?" Pelon knew his days as an informant were numbered. A month and a half later, just before dawn, on January 29, 2016, roughly 500 police officers swept through the Boston area. Operation Mean Streets had reached its peak, and after the meeting in Virginia, the feds decided to pull Pelon out. It was always on our minds as he was driving around with these known killers who lived to kill informants. "Do they know? Is this a setup?" says Flynn, the Homeland Security agent. "Every time he was in the car with these guys and they were driving somewhere, we'd cringe and the hair on the back of our necks would stand straight up." 56 people were arrested that day, including Chucky and Demente, largely because Pelon had captured their confessions in his cab. At one site in East Boston, neighbors applauded as agents led an MS-13 member into a police cruiser in handcuffs. These were the immigrants who we were protecting, the ones that were being victimized by the immigrants who preyed on them, Flynn recalled. As Conley put it, "We got the worst of the worst that morning." The number of defendants would swell to 61 as some of those who were indicted, including Muerto, the man who introduced Pelon to MS-13, began to cut deals with prosecutors. They agreed to testify against La Mara Salvatrucha in return for lighter sentences or to avoid deportation. These guys portray their image as if they're one of the hardest, most ruthless gangs out there, but in the end, they fell and cooperated just like all the other gangs. As a result of Pelon's undercover work in Virginia, the investigation reached well beyond the Boston area, ensnaring the head of MS-13's East Coast division as well as Sugar, who was indicted again from his El Salvador cell. "He was the best informant I ever had," said Levitt, the assistant U.S. attorney who's now in private practice. "Over the past 2 years, all but one defendant either pleaded guilty or were convicted and sentenced to decades behind bars, followed by deportation. The final defendant is now on trial. The cases included 6 murders. 3 of the victims were teenage boys and 1 a young woman. 22 attempted murders and dozens of other violent crimes. The Obama-era operation was the largest takedown of MS-13 in U.S. history, and Attorney General Jeff Sessions traveled to Boston in September 2017 to personally congratulate law enforcement officials and deliver a message to remaining MS-13 members. "We're coming for you," Sessions said. "We will hunt you down. We will find you. We will bring you to justice." Will they? Can Jeff Sessions stand firmly behind his statement? It's only been a little less than 5 years since this investigation, and already Mara has significantly recovered, not only in numbers but also in power. Experts say the reality is more complicated. Some local police chiefs argue that the Trump administration's aggressive immigration raids have made many more undocumented immigrants the targets of MS-13, less likely to report crimes and cooperate with police. Last year, the FBI noted a nationwide surge in MS-13 killings. Undocumented teens are still being groomed and girls are now being recruited, something that's been banned in El Salvador. In fact, the girlfriends of MS-13 homeboys convicted in Operation Mean Streets have taken over some local cliques. For his part, Pelon is now in hiding. After the takedown, the FBI made good on his deal. It declined to prosecute him for the cab robberies because doing so would jeopardize his family's safety. A total of 17 people related to Pelon now receive witness protection. He still talks to Millet, Conley, and a few of his other handlers who provide updates on the case. They visited him and his girlfriend after the birth of their daughter. MS-13 recently put out a green light for her, his infant daughter. They obviously want to hit Pelon where it hurts by killing his kids and those whom he cherishes the most. But resorting to killing babies and kids doesn't make you ruthless, and it sure don't make you tough. Where I'm from, California, it makes you a piece of shit. We don't kill babies, and when you cross that line, you become a target yourself. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Media Profiles. We got some good content we're going to be dropping these next couple of weeks. Aside from these profile episodes, we're going to be dropping phone calls, member profiles, lives, and Q&As. We appreciate all the support, and please don't forget to help us build our other channel, Paradigm Entertainment Productions, by subbing to that channel. We plan on dropping exclusive content on that channel as well.